Dirty bombs, bioterrorism, electromagnetic pulse attacks. Are you prepared to survive the end when the next disaster strikes? Terrorism expert and former Army Lieutenant Colonel James J. Carafano has created the guide for everyday Americans to weather the harshest storms. It's called Surviving the End, and it's a disaster preparation book. It contains practical, achievable, common sense skills and precautions that anyone can take to be a little more prepared for the next big disaster. So here to discuss his new book is Dr. James Carafano. Welcome, James. Always good to have you back.
Hey, it's good to be with you.
Well, where do we start, buddy? You know, missile attacks, earthquakes, rivers of blood, rains of frogs, dogs and cats lying down together. It's sheer mayhem out there. Do we live in a more dangerous age than we did just a little while ago?
Yeah, it really doesn't matter. I mean, we ought to be concerned about taking care of our friends and our family, regardless of whether, Putin's on the march or not. That's what's really important. I think that's the main message of the book. So the most interesting question I asked myself was, well, look, if we did have a disaster, who's going to survive? And interestingly enough, the most likely person to survive a disaster is a church-going, married, high school-educated, gun-toting yoga instructor. And the reason for that is there are attributes of what makes somebody a really good survivor, and they're actually kind of common sense things if you think about them. One is faith. People of faith are much more decisive, they have much lower levels of stress, and they're actually much better able to cope with disasters. People who are in a family or who understand the value of family are actually better leaders. They're more cohesive in terms of their community, and they're the kind of people who draw people together to get things done. Look, I went through all the science of what do you need to know about all the stuff you just mentioned, dirty bombs, missiles, whatever, and it found out if you have a good high school education, which maybe isn't the easiest thing to get, but if you did, you really know all the science you need to know to make the logical, rational decisions to keep you and your family based. And you have to be healthy. I talk about yoga in the book because that's what I do. I do yoga. But lifestyle and nutrition, those are important. And the gun-toting thing is kind of, I went through all this kind of advice from FEMA and everybody else and everything. And, all these manuals, nobody ever says, dude, get a gun. And just be able to protect yourself and your family, that's really kind of fundamental to this. And so one of the logical things is, why shouldn't somebody have a gun in their home if they want it to protect themselves and their families? It's perfectly appropriate. Might be a little politically incorrect, but that's what the book's really all about, is because, when the disaster happens, the last thing you need to worry about is being politically correct.
Yeah, you got that exactly right, James. During the the Rodney King riots out here, any number of people that I knew at the time who were conservatives who had weapons suddenly got calls from their big liberal friends who'd been anti-gun people their entire lives saying, hey, do you have anything you can spare while the rest of the world's on fire? But let's get to the government issue, because I think this is really the key point here. We're seeing a world where more and more people are becoming more and more dependent on the government every day, and the government seems to be interested in that business. But it's unlikely that the government will be able to save you during a major crisis. Why is it, do you think, it's so important that people get it into their heads that there is not going to be Uncle Sam or the Army coming to rescue you within the first 2 or 3 or 4 days? Why is it so important that people have some kind of plan for getting through those first 72 hours on their own?
Yeah, that's a crucial point. As you scale a disaster, the government's going to be more strained in getting to you. I mean, time and space matter, and numbers matter. I mean, we've seen this in every large-scale disaster. Katrina, even in Sandy, we saw it in Japan with Fukushima. And, we often say, well, government's all screwed up. Well, yeah, government actually is all screwed up, and it's not going to not be all screwed up just because it's a disaster. But then when you scale on top of that, the magnitude of the problem, the reality is people just kind of need to be able to take care of themselves. I think that's one of the fundamental messages of the book. But the other is it is so incredibly doable. But there's another point in there as well, is if you listen to the government and you do all the things that the government says, which is let us tell you how to educate your children. Let us be dependent on us for a job. Let us tell you how to live your life. If you give away all the things that make you an individual and able to embrace opportunity initiative, and you're dependent on the government, when the government fails you, you're going to be the least prepared to survive in the event of a disaster.
So you're basically saying that this is essentially a large-scale version of what a lot of gun rights advocates say, and that is when seconds count, the police are only minutes away. When minutes count, the government's only days away. You talked about the importance of good health, but let's talk about the kind of person who you think would survive a major catastrophe, a serious catastrophe, expanded over a large area. It's a lot to do with independence. You mentioned faith and the ability to make decisions. Can you briefly go over those 5 foundations? And it sounds to me, James, what you're really talking about is mental toughness.
Well, that has a lot to do with it, and physical resilience as well. Look, if you're a healthy person, if you have a strong immune system, if you don't have diabetes, if you don't have coronary disease, the odds of you are surviving are just much more important. And if you look at who are the victims in most disasters, they're the people that are most vulnerable. So small children and the aged and people with either physical or system disabilities. And what happens if those people are part of your family, though? You're going to have to look out for them. You're going to have to take care of them. So you personally need to be healthy and strong because you have to help. You're going to have to help people who are going to be dependent on you. Because there's a great story in the book from 9/11 and about a young man who was on one of the upper floors and basically was walking down, and he's walking down the stairs, and he gets to about, I don't remember, the 80th floor or so, and he encounters a big heavyset guy who just says, I can't go on, I can't go on, I can't walk. And he tries to help him, but it's obviously not going to work. And then he says, okay, I will send somebody back for you. And of course, by the time he got to the ground floor, seconds later, the building collapsed. So that man, because he couldn't walk down 80 flights of stairs, he died. And the notion that if you think you're going to sit on the couch and be a couch potato, and then all of a sudden your couch isn't going to be there anymore because it's taken away by a flood, and you're going to be responsible for yourself and you want to live, well, that's not the time to start thinking about, maybe I shouldn't eat so many Cheez-Its.
Well, we talk about the 72-hour mark being crucial in surviving a major incident. I don't think many people understand exactly what that means. Power's out, ATMs don't work, there's no water, there's no food, there's no electricity to pump the water. So it seems to me that there are actually some fairly simple things that people can do to get through 72 hours. If you just had to quickly list just a few things, what could you tell our viewers to go out and do right now today?
Right. So the first one is the 1 hour. And what the 1 hour is if you have a critical injury, you lose an arm, blood loss, a puncture wound, some kind of really serious injury, and you can't get medical attention in that first hour, you're going to die. So that means that somebody around you has to have the basics of just good first aid. How do you deal with shock, traumatic injury, and blood loss? Right? So if you get through that first hour, you don't die from those things. Then you got about 3 days, because in 3 days, if you don't get water or shelter, you're not going to survive. And so that's the next ticket, which is how do you have the basic fundamentals to get through that 3 days? And then afterwards, you got about 3 weeks. I mean, if you don't get food in 3 weeks, you're going to starve to death. And, most of these disasters, really, what you really need to worry about is that first 72 hours. But you ought to be able to make it in that first 72 hours. And this is one of the key things on the book that I really talk about. I think some people think of survival in terms of me personally surviving, me, my family, or whatever. What we found is what makes you more likely to survive is not detaching yourself from community, not jumping in the station wagon and driving and living in the mountains. It's really being a good member of your community and working within your community to make sure you as a group survive. Because the odds are, no matter how poor a community is, if it is confident and coherent in facing a disaster, even under the worst conditions, you're going to be able to get through 72 hours. Good example of that in the book. So we talk about the Vietnamese community in New Orleans, which came through very, very well, in large part because they're a very, very cohesive community. And when they knew they had to evacuate the city, they went out and they said, well, who really needs to leave? And they made sure that the family members and the members of their community that couldn't weather 72 hours, that they were on a bus and they were headed somewhere. And more importantly, that they talked to Vietnamese people in surrounding communities to make sure there was somebody there to meet them and take care of them. And the people that stayed behind, who looked after their property and kind of told them what was going on, when it was safe to come back, they made sure together that they could take care of themselves and each other. So that's the kind of stuff the book really goes into.
Let's talk finally, before we close today, about why people just don't seem to prepare for disasters. I kind of call it the Challenger effect, because when the Challenger exploded, we found out that several flights prior to the explosion, they had burn-throughs on the O-rings on the solid rocket boosters, and it didn't blow up that day, and it didn't blow up the next time, so it probably won't blow up today. Saw the same thing with Columbia, where the foam came off of the tank and hit the orbiter, and it didn't destroy the orbiter, and it didn't, and it probably won't this time. What is it about the denial, do you think, James, that's so powerful today? And do you actually think, because I certainly am beginning to think, that the more secure we are and the less danger we have to face, the less willing we are to look at any idea of life-threatening danger?
Well, that's a really good point. And that's actually one of the things I talk about in the beginning of the book. One of the statistics that I throw out there is that the average American spends $1,700 a year preparing for vacation. They spend virtually nothing preparing for a disaster. So think about that, is they'll spend $1,700 to go have a mediocre week at Disney World, and spend a lot more money and wind up yelling and screaming at the kids. But to make sure that the people that they love and the things that they've worked their whole life for, that they're still standing after an earthquake or a fire or a flood, they'll spend on average nothing to get ready for that. And well, why is that? And that is something I talk about in the book. One of the things you mentioned is exactly right. People think it's just not going to happen to me. But and I talk about this in the book. You go through the scales and the scale of disasters and where disasters happen, and it's full of all kinds of people who thought nothing will ever happen to them. But the other is this kind of culture of dependency, where our government is consistently telling us, we'll take care of you. You should be depending on us. We'll be there for you. And what that does is it creates this environment of complacency. So you add up all those things, and it leads to this incredible fact that there are actually very, very simple things we can do. We don't have to have a basement full of freeze-dried beef and a 50 caliber machine gun and a bomb shelter to survive. There's very, very simple things that we can do. It actually has nothing to do with wealth. Poor people can survive just as good, if not better, than rich people. But it has to do with having the lifestyle, making the right lifestyle choices, the mental preparation, and just a few very, very common things to make sure that you can get through the worst of times.
Yeah, I was at some show somewhere, and I saw a red backpack that was 10 person days of food and water. It was $100, and I just bought it. It's in the trunk of my car. It goes with me wherever I go, and I have a fair amount of water at home, too. James, always so good to hear from you. Thank you so much for stopping by. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, you don't have to have a cellar full of canned goods or battlefield combat training to follow these recommendations. You can find out more in Surviving the End, which is available starting February 16th in the PJ store. For PJ TV, I'm Bill Whittle. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.